Welcome to Somnia Lore.
The first thing Rick remembered, though he could hardly call it memory, was the quiet hum beneath his cradle. It wasn't a lullaby his parents sang, nor the creak of the floorboards. It was something else entirely, soft and persistent, like the whisper of a universe breathing. He could feel it through the wooden frame of his crib, through the thin cotton sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and old summer air. Even then, before he understood words or faces, he knew he was not quite in the same rhythm as the rest of the world. He was listening to something else, something that wanted to be heard if he leaned in gently enough. He opened his eyes, though he did not yet know their purpose, and saw the shadows dancing along the walls, long and soft in the candlelight. The shadows moved like curious fingers reaching for secrets, stretching and curling without urgency. Rick thought he understood them then, in a way that nobody else could. They were stories waiting to be told. The world felt immense and patient, and he felt tiny and wide awake all at once. Some nights he would lie there, counting the soft patterns of light on the ceiling, the way each flicker seemed to have a voice. A voice that was not loud, not commanding, but full of attention, full of care. And even as a child who barely knew words, he felt an unspoken warmth settle into him. "We truly love and care for you," it seemed to whisper. And he knew, though he did not yet understand how, that it included everyone, even those who were asleep. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Rick's early days were full of small, uncanny observations. A leaf would spin lazily in the wind, and he would pause to follow it, feeling the rhythm of its fall as if it were his own heartbeat. A shadow would linger longer than it should, and he would find a secret joy in tracing its shape on the wall. People moved quickly around him, talking and gesturing, but he felt the pauses in between, the quiet spaces where things waited to happen. It was here that he began to notice the soft pulse of the universe, subtle, unhurried and tenderly persistent. Even as a boy, he had friends he barely spoke to, connections that existed in shared glances and silent understanding. Morty, though he would meet him much later, could have been one of them, a kindred spirit in quiet wonder. There was an old neighbor, a woman whose hands smelled of bread and thyme, who let him sit on her porch while she hummed tunes he could feel more than hear. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart. And in that understanding, Rick's first empathy was born, soft, pliable, capable of stretching far beyond his small world. He began to notice things others overlooked, the way dust motes twirled like tiny galaxies in a sunbeam, the way raindrops drew delicate constellations on the window, the faint, tender hums that seemed to come from the spaces between walls. The world was alive with quiet mysteries, and though fear sometimes lurked at the edges, curiosity was far stronger. He would lie in bed, eyes wide in the dark, imagining these hidden corners of reality, letting each small wonder seep into him like warm tea. Rick learned gradually the rhythm of his own mind. Thoughts would come, soft and slow, before rushing ahead like a river released from a dam. He learned to sit with them, to follow their currents without trying to control them. And in these moments, he felt something akin to magic, though he did not yet call it that. He felt the pulse of possibility in each quiet choice, in each tender observation of the world around him. There were nights when he felt lonely, a deep and settling solitude that felt like the soft weight of a cloud pressing gently against his chest. But even in that loneliness there was warmth. The universe did not abandon him. It whispered, in ways only he could hear, that he belonged, that he was seen, and that he was part of something larger, mysterious and patient. He imagined his own small fingers brushing against infinite stars, the soft vibration of worlds humming back in response, and he believed, because he felt it, that someone, somewhere, would understand the gentle rhythm of him too. Rick's childhood home was small and ordinary in every way that mattered to other people. Yet in the quiet hours, it became a universe in miniature, with hidden doors, soft echoes, and corners that seemed to sigh with stories. He would trace these corners with his fingertips, learning their secrets in the most delicate ways, and feel a satisfaction deeper than any toy or game could give. The ordinary in its patient stillness became extraordinary. By the time he was old enough to remember things more clearly, Rick had begun to notice patterns beyond his immediate world. The repetition of seasons, the gentle loops of day and night, the soft coincidences of falling leaves and drifting clouds, they all felt like gentle nudges, reminders that life was more than movement and noise. He learned that he could listen, truly listen, and that listening was a kind of power, a subtle skill that could touch hearts and ease worries without anyone noticing. And so, Rick grew slowly, quietly, with the universe as both guide and companion. He learned that wonder could be gentle, that courage could be silent, and that the deepest truths often whispered rather than shouted. Every night, he would lie under the soft quilt of stars that only he seemed to see, letting their distant shimmer wrap around him like a lullaby. And in the soft hum of existence, he began to understand that small acts, noticing, caring, pausing, could be more powerful than any grand adventure. As he drifted to sleep, still a child but already attuned to the delicate rhythm of the cosmos, Rick felt the quiet pulse of the universe beneath him. It was patient, attentive, and unending. He closed his eyes and let it cradle him, letting the gentle, whispering secrets of existence fill him until he became part of the soft, slow heartbeat of everything around him. And somewhere in the vast stretch of worlds he had yet to see, that gentle hum waited for him to discover it again, and again in endless loops of wonder. Morty was not a boy of grand gestures or bold words. He was small in every sense, with a slow smile that took time to form, and eyes that lingered on details most others ignored. He noticed the way sunlight pooled in corners of rooms, the quiet weight of a falling leaf, the way a dog's tail wagged not in haste, but in small, measured joy. It was a way of seeing the world that made everything feel both larger and softer, like a secret tucked into the folds of ordinary days. He remembered the first time he felt truly awake, lying on the damp grass behind his house, listening to the hum of cicadas as the evening turned violet. It was a night both familiar and strange, the kind of night that seemed stitched together by invisible threads. The stars blinked slowly, patiently, as though the sky itself was thinking before it spoke. Morty felt the same way, as if he were learning a language older than anyone could name, a rhythm of existence that asked nothing but quiet attention. Morty's family lived in a house of ordinary walls, yet it contained corners that held their own soft histories. His older brother, though often impatient and distracted, had a gentle streak that surfaced in moments Morty could barely anticipate. He would hand Morty a slice of bread with jam without a word, and Morty felt the weight of that gesture more deeply than 1,000 spoken instructions. The smallest acts, he was learning, carried more meaning than the loudest declarations. School offered Morty its own lessons, though he rarely noticed them at the time. He observed classmates with quiet curiosity, tracing patterns in their gestures, the way one child's foot tapped while thinking, or how another's hand twitched when excited. He began to understand without judgment the rhythm of people, the subtle signals that passed between them like whispers in the wind. Morty's empathy was growing in these small spaces, a gentle current that moved quietly, unseen but steady. One afternoon, Morty discovered the first of many strange corners of the world he would come to know. Behind a chain-link fence at the edge of the playground, a small portal shimmered faintly, like the mirage of water on a summer road. He did not touch it at first, not out of fear but out of respect. It hummed softly, a quiet vibration that matched the pulse of his own chest. He traced the edges with his fingertips and felt the faint brush of possibility. He did not yet understand what lay beyond, but he understood that it was a space alive with gentle secrets, and that his noticing it mattered. It was in these moments that Morty began to notice the difference between seeing and truly observing. Seeing was passive. Observing was attentive, patient, deliberate. He watched the world breathe, as if each sigh of wind, each distant bird call was a message meant for him alone. And slowly, he realized that the universe was not always loud in its guidance. Sometimes it whispered, and sometimes it waited, and sometimes it folded itself into quiet patterns that only those who listened could follow. Morty had a mentor, though he did not yet know to call him that. A neighbor, older than anyone he had met, with hair like silver threads and eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of light. The man did not speak much, but his presence was gentle and insistent, a kind of quiet gravity that drew Morty closer. He would leave little notes, small sketches of stars and strange shapes, and Morty learned to trace them with his fingertips, feeling the warmth of thought behind each line. It was here in the soft transmission of care that Morty began to understand that wisdom could be quiet, slow and unassuming, yet deep and transformative. The world outside his home was often noisy, though Morty discovered that even noise carried its own lullaby. The rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the soft thrum of traffic, all these combined into a subtle symphony if one paid attention. Morty began to match his breathing to the cadence of these sounds, feeling an internal harmony arise from the attentive observation of external life. It was the first true lesson in patience, and it stayed with him, shaping him in ways that would later matter beyond imagination. There were times when Morty felt small, almost insignificant beneath the vast unending sky. The stars overhead seemed so distant, so impossibly far, and yet they shimmered in a quiet dialogue with him. He would lie back on cool grass, hands behind his head, tracing constellations with his fingers, imagining that they whispered back. In these moments, he realized that loneliness could be a companion if approached gently, that even silence could teach, and that connection was not always immediate. Sometimes it existed in patient observation, in the quiet understanding of a presence far away. Morty also began to notice the unusual ways he felt for people, the deep empathy that would sometimes surprise him. He could sense moods as easily as temperature, subtle shifts in energy like wind brushing through hair. It was a skill he did not yet name, a soft power that would follow him into adolescence and beyond. In moments of tension, he discovered that listening carefully, offering a soft word or simply being present, could soothe in ways that action or argument never could. These small gestures, unnoticed by most, became the cornerstone of his quiet heroism. The portal behind the fence remained a steady enigma. Morty returned to it often, sometimes alone, sometimes with his mentor nearby. He would sit beside it in silence, letting its gentle hum mix with the sound of his own breathing. There was no urgency, no need to leap into the unknown. The portal was patient as the stars themselves, and Morty felt an unspoken reassurance that it would wait, always. In this he learned the lesson of balance, of timing, of quiet anticipation, of understanding that some truths arrive only when we are ready. By the end of his childhood, Morty had grown in subtle, unremarkable ways that mattered far more than anyone could measure. He learned to observe, to listen, to notice the unseen threads that connected moments, objects, and hearts. He discovered that small acts, gentle attention, and patient presence could ripple outward, touching the world more profoundly than loud deeds ever could. And as he drifted to sleep each night, lying beneath quilts stitched with ordinary patterns that now seemed extraordinary, he felt the same pulse that had always hummed quietly beneath existence, a patient, attentive rhythm, waiting to be noticed, to be loved, and to be shared. Rick had grown taller now, but not in the ways that mattered most. His mind stretched further than his limbs, reaching into corners of thought and imagination that others scarcely noticed. He had learned the gentle art of watching, of waiting, of letting possibilities unfold without forcing them. And in the spaces between action and observation, he discovered his first quiet adventures, small, unremarkable, yet brimming with invisible wonder. It was a late afternoon when he first noticed the portal humming differently. It had been years since he first glimpsed the shimmer behind the chain-link fence, yet it remained patient, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive fully awake. He approached it slowly, listening to its faint vibration, which now carried a tone warmer than before, a melody almost imperceptible, soft as a lullaby. He pressed a hand near the edge and felt a pulse, subtle and insistent, as though the universe was acknowledging his presence. He smiled without thinking. The portal did not demand, it did not rush. It simply existed, and he existed with it. Morty was not far behind, stepping quietly as he often did, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the moment. He had grown in his own quiet ways, carrying patience and empathy like a lantern in dark rooms. He followed Rick with a soft attentiveness, noticing the subtle quiver of the portal, the way the air around it seemed warmer, heavier, almost alive. He could not explain why, but he felt the urge to wait, to breathe with it, to let understanding come in its own time. And in that shared silence a bond deepened, one unspoken yet unbreakable. The two of them leaned toward the portal, letting its soft hum fill the space between them. Rick closed his eyes and imagined the worlds beyond, not with fear or excitement, but with a gentle curiosity. He could feel threads of life stretching across realities, threads that pulsed like distant heartbeats. He imagined the quiet stories being told in these far-off places, children discovering small joys, strangers noticing acts of kindness, moments of wonder passing unnoticed. And he felt faintly that he too was part of this unending weave, a small node in a vast, patient tapestry. Morty reached out to touch the edge of the shimmer, but paused, feeling the subtle pushback, the quiet insistence that the portal was not to be hurried. He closed his eyes, taking a breath that matched the rhythm of the hum, and let himself simply be. There was no urgency. The portal, like the universe itself, asked only for attention, not action. Morty felt a sense of calm spread through him, a soft warmth that made his small chest rise and fall with a gentle ease. In that moment, he realized that being present could be as powerful as doing anything else. The afternoon drifted into evening, and the light turned soft and amber, brushing across the edges of trees, leaves, and walls. Rick watched the shadows stretch long and slow, and he remembered the first times he had seen shadows dance along the walls of his childhood room. They were stories waiting to be told, secrets folding into themselves, and he felt the same quiet thrill as he had years ago. He realized that adventure did not always roar or demand attention. Sometimes it whispered, patient and subtle, waiting for someone willing to notice. They remained there for hours, letting the world breathe around them. The portal pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to sync with their own heartbeats, each vibration a gentle reminder that the universe was vast, but also tender. Rick spoke softly, almost as if afraid to disturb the calm, and Morty listened. They shared thoughts that did not need words, the comfort of quiet presence, the beauty in small discoveries, the gentle acknowledgement that the world was alive in ways unseen, yet deeply felt. It was in these moments that Rick began to understand his subtle powers, not as grand abilities, but as quiet traits that shaped the lives of those around him. His curiosity was empathy, stretching into places others could not reach. His patience was protection, a soft shield against harm that might come from haste or misunderstanding. And his observation was care, attentive and unassuming, capable of noticing needs before they were spoken aloud. He saw these qualities mirrored in Morty, the boy whose quiet attentiveness was equally transformative, whose gentle curiosity could soothe even the most restless hearts. They did not speak of dangers or of the weight of responsibility. There was no rush to conquer, no need to prove themselves. Their adventure was already unfolding in the quiet harmony between them, in the patient observation of the portal, in the acknowledgement of life beyond the ordinary. Rick traced the patterns of light on the ground, noting the way shadows shifted and softened, the way the air itself seemed to hum with attention. Morty followed, letting the small details wash over him, feeling the pulse of possibility in every subtle motion. Night arrived gently, folding the world into deep blues and silvers. The stars above blinked slowly, serene and deliberate, and the portal's hum softened as if in response to the quiet cosmos. Rick and Morty lay back on the grass, hands brushing against each other lightly, feeling the connection of shared attention and mutual wonder. In the vastness of the night, in the hum of distant worlds, they understood that adventure was not always movement or change. Sometimes it was stillness, observation, and the patience to witness beauty unfold without demand. As the first hints of sleep brushed against their eyelids, Rick allowed himself a final thought. The universe had always been speaking, and he had learned at last to listen. Morty felt the same pulse, a soft rhythm that promised guidance, warmth, and quiet reassurance. The portal shimmered one last time in the cool night air, a gentle reminder that some things wait patiently and tenderly for those who notice, and with that both boys closed their eyes, letting the hum of the multiverse carry them. A gentle lullaby that promised safety, curiosity, and connection. Somewhere beyond the shimmer, worlds whispered their secrets softly, patiently, as if to say that wonder existed everywhere, waiting to be observed with love and care. The morning light crept gently across the horizon, soft and slow, spilling gold over rooftops and quiet streets. Rick and Morty had slept beneath the whispering sky, and when they awoke the world felt softer, more alive, as if each blade of grass, each drifting cloud, carried its own gentle story. Rick stretched, letting the morning air fill his lungs, noticing the way the wind carried the faint hum of distant places. It was a rhythm he had grown accustomed to, a pulse that whispered of worlds unseen and possibilities unspoken. Morty sat beside him, small shoulders rising and falling with the steady cadence of quiet breathing. He traced his fingers along the patterns of dew on the grass, fascinated by the way sunlight refracted through tiny droplets, creating small, fleeting constellations. He did not speak, but the presence of his attention was enough. Rick felt it like a gentle warmth, a tether to the world that reminded him of the beauty in observing rather than controlling. It was a lesson he had long internalized, but Morty's presence deepened its meaning. They wandered slowly toward the outskirts of the town, moving without urgency, letting curiosity guide them rather than any need for adventure or spectacle. Shadows of trees stretched long and delicate, brushing across paths and fences, and Rick felt the same quiet thrill he had known as a child, that the ordinary held secrets, and that those who noticed could find them everywhere. Morty's eyes followed the shadows, his movements soft and deliberate, his awareness of the world as attentive as the stars themselves. They came upon an old, abandoned greenhouse, its glass panels streaked with rain and age. The smell of earth and forgotten seasons seeped through the cracks, a faint perfume of memories. Rick lingered at the doorway, noticing how the light caught the dust in long golden streaks. Inside, plants grew wildly, unconcerned with neat rows or careful pruning, and Rick marveled at the quiet persistence of life in the forgotten corners of the world. Morty knelt to touch the moss carpeting the floor, feeling its softness under his palms, the slow pulse of growth beneath his fingertips. A single delicate vine trailed across the floor, its tendrils reaching toward the sunlight, like fingers seeking warmth. Rick watched it bend and stretch, remembering the first time he had noticed the small, unnoticed things in his childhood room, the way shadows and light moved with secret purpose. He thought of the portal, and of all the worlds he had glimpsed, and he felt again that sense of patient wonder, that the universe did not need to shout to be extraordinary. Morty, sensing the same, whispered, "It's like it knows we're watching." Rick nodded softly, not because he agreed, but because he understood what Morty felt. They moved through the greenhouse together, their steps slow, careful, as if the ground itself might reveal another secret if treated with gentle attention. Rick noticed a small bird nesting in a cracked pot, its feathers ruffled yet alive with soft energy. Morty crouched nearby, breathing in sync with the bird, letting its calm permeate him. Rick saw the quiet connection forming, invisible yet undeniable, observer and life, meeting in moments that mattered more than words. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling leaves and carrying a distant, almost inaudible melody. Rick recognized it as a lullaby of sorts, though not one sung by any human voice. It was a song of the world, of things moving in harmony, of life continuing quietly despite its small tragedies and triumphs. Morty closed his eyes, letting the wind carry the notes through him, feeling the gentle vibration of the universe settle into his chest. He opened his eyes slowly, meeting Rick's gaze, and in that look passed an understanding too subtle to name. They were both listeners now, part of the soft music that existed beneath ordinary life. They continued their walk, following the path where light met shadow, where quiet corners promised hidden stories. Rick reached down to pick up a fallen feather, white with a faint golden sheen. He turned it over in his fingers, noticing its delicate structure, the subtle curves and softness that had survived wind and rain. Morty leaned closer, tracing the feather lightly with a fingertip, feeling the gentle vibration of its story, as if it had lived a small life and now wished to share it with anyone who would notice. Hours passed in a rhythm of silence and soft observation. They did not speak often, for words were unnecessary when attention itself carried meaning. Rick felt a calm deep in his chest, a warmth that arose not from triumph or knowledge, but from the quiet act of noticing. Morty felt it too, an echoing comfort that filled spaces he had never understood he could hold. Each step, each breath became a meditation, a reminder that small moments of care and attention were a kind of magic, invisible yet potent. As evening approached, the world dimmed into a soft blue haze, the sky streaked with whispers of clouds catching the last light of day. Rick and Morty found a small hill overlooking the town, and they sat together in the slow, unhurried silence. Rick reached out and brushed Morty's hand lightly, a gesture both familiar and significant, a quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding. Morty responded with a gentle squeeze, and in that simple contact lay a wealth of unspoken words. Trust, comfort, connection, and the shared thrill of quiet wonder. The first stars began to appear, timid and small at first, then more confident as darkness deepened. Rick noticed their slow blinking, each one a heartbeat of distant worlds, and he felt again the pull of curiosity, not urgent or demanding, but gentle, insistent in its calm way. Morty leaned back, letting the night sky fill him, tracing constellations with his imagination, feeling the hum of life continue softly beneath the visible world. And in that moment, neither of them moved. They simply existed, listening to the pulse of wind, shadow, and distant worlds, letting the gentle rhythm of life wash over them. The ordinary had become extraordinary once again, not through spectacle, but through attention, care, and quiet empathy. Adventure, they understood, was not always something to chase. Sometimes it was the patient act of noticing, of being present, and letting the world reveal its soft secrets in its own time. The sky was a pale wash of morning, soft as unspun silk, when Rick and Morty wandered toward the edge of town, drawn not by urgency, but by a quiet curiosity that hummed beneath their steps. The streets were empty, save for a few early risers and the distant call of a dog greeting the new day. Rick noticed the subtle patterns of light on the pavement, how it caught imperfections in the cracks and filled them with faint gold. Morty followed, careful not to step too heavily, as if each footfall could disturb the invisible stories hidden in the ordinary world. They reached a small, forgotten park, where the swing set creaked gently in the wind, and the grass was dotted with tiny flowers that trembled like whispers. Rick paused, leaning against a worn post, and watched a single leaf drift lazily from a tree. It spun and turned in the sunlight, and he felt the same thrill he had known as a child, that quiet awe that comes when noticing something fleeting, yet profound. Morty crouched nearby, fingertips brushing the petals of a violet, feeling the subtle vibrations of life that passed unnoticed by most. It was a soft magic, the kind that left no mark but lingered in the heart. Rick remembered his first acts of quiet kindness, small gestures that seemed inconsequential at the time, but left unseen ripples in the world. He recalled how he had once left a note for a neighbor, telling them that their garden looked beautiful, though he had never spoken the words aloud. Morty, too, had begun forming his own tender rituals, moments of attention that quietly lifted others, returning a lost book to its owner, helping a friend carry a heavy load, offering a small smile when words failed. They were both learning that heroism did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, barely noticed, but still profound. The park led them to an old fountain, dry and cracked, its marble surface worn smooth by years of wind and rain. Rick ran a hand along the edge, feeling the faint ridges, imagining the water that had once flowed there and the stories it had carried. Morty traced the outline of a carved flower, feeling its faint relief beneath his fingers. "Do you think it remembers?" he asked softly. Rick smiled, considering the question. "Maybe it does," he said, "in the way we remember small things, in ways that matter more than we realize." They sat together on the edge of the fountain, letting the morning sun warm them. Rick observed the shadows moving through the trees, shifting slowly as if alive. Morty noticed the quiet patterns of birds in the distance, their wings tracing invisible lines in the air. Time seemed to stretch and fold, a gentle loop of moments flowing seamlessly into one another. Rick realized that adventure, in its purest form, was the careful attention to such loops, the noticing of life as it quietly pulsed, unnoticed yet persistent. Rick's thoughts drifted toward the portal, its faint hum echoing in memory, a reminder of worlds both vast and tender. He thought of the possibilities, not as challenges to conquer, but as quiet mysteries to observe, to sit with and understand. Morty, sensing the shift in Rick's attention, placed a hand lightly on his arm, a gesture that needed no words. Together they sat in that shared stillness, connected not through speech or action, but through the patient recognition of one another's presence. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of flowers and distant rain. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the wind synchronize with his heartbeat. Morty leaned back, head tilted to the sky, listening to the subtle vibrations of life in every direction. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the city awakening, the faint pulse of the unseen portal somewhere beyond their world. In that moment, they both understood that the universe communicated in gentle rhythms, not in forceful commands, and that listening was the first act of love. The afternoon drifted lazily into soft golden light. Rick and Morty wandered through alleys and side streets, noticing the unnoticed, a cracked window with sunlight spilling through, a cat pausing in mid-step to glance at something only it could see, a cluster of dandelions growing stubbornly through a crack in the pavement. Each detail was a story, small yet profound, waiting to be recognized. Morty's eyes softened with awareness, feeling the gentle thrill of being attuned to these quiet wonders. Rick felt the same, a reminder that the ordinary carried its own extraordinary, and that noticing it was a kind of subtle heroism. They stopped at a small bakery, where the faint smell of bread and sugar floated in the air. Rick bought a loaf, warm from the oven, and handed a piece to Morty. They shared it silently, the soft texture and faint sweetness a small ritual of comfort. Morty chewed slowly, savoring the flavor, but more than that, the presence of Rick, the shared acknowledgement of small pleasures, the quiet bond strengthened by attention and care. The act was unremarkable to anyone passing by, yet it was monumental in its gentle significance. As evening approached, the light softened to pale blue, stretching long and calm across rooftops and streets. Rick and Morty returned to the hill where they had watched the stars before, laying side by side in the grass. The first stars appeared, tentative and faint, then more confidently, blinking slowly like distant lanterns of the cosmos. Rick traced constellations with a fingertip in the air, feeling the gentle vibration of possibility in each one. Morty mirrored the gesture, connecting the stars in invisible lines, drawing soft maps of the heart that only they could see. They did not speak, for words were unnecessary. Their shared attention was enough, a silent conversation of presence, understanding, and quiet wonder. Rick noticed the faint hum of distant worlds, a pulse he had felt before echoing softly through the night. Morty felt it too, a gentle rhythm that matched the beat of his own chest. In that quiet communion, both understood that the greatest adventures were not always outward journeys but inward ones, noticing, listening, and feeling the subtle currents of connection that tied them to each other and to the universe. As darkness settled fully, Rick allowed himself a soft exhale, a quiet acknowledgement of the day's small triumphs. Attention given, bond strengthened, wonder observed. Morty leaned lightly against him, letting the night's gentle calm settle into his body. The stars above continued their slow, deliberate blinking, as if whispering that the universe was patient, and that it waited for those who noticed, those who cared, those who simply were, and with that, they closed their eyes together, letting the pulse of the world, faint yet insistent, cradle them into a soft, dreamless sleep, a quiet lullaby that promised warmth, presence, and gentle continuity. The morning air carried a soft chill, gentle enough to stir goosebumps along Rick's arms, yet warm with the promise of day. He and Morty walked slowly along the path that wound through the outskirts of the town, following no map, guided only by curiosity and the quiet pulse of the world around them. Rick noticed the way sunlight fell in slanted lines between trees, catching dust motes that floated lazily, like tiny stars in mid-air. He bent to touch one with a fingertip, marveling at its delicate shimmer, and Morty did the same, sharing the silent delight of discovery. They passed a small creek, its waters murmuring as it wound through stones polished smooth by years of gentle flow. Rick crouched to run his hand through the water, feeling its coldness and weight, noticing the way the light fractured across the surface into fleeting rainbows. Morty sat nearby on a moss-covered rock, dipping a toe in, feeling the soft tug of current and imagining the unseen journeys of tiny creatures beneath the surface. It was in these quiet moments, Rick realized, that the universe revealed its patience, life moving forward without insistence, stories unfolding slowly in ways that required nothing but attention to notice. The air shifted faintly, carrying scents of damp earth, pine, and something indefinably sweet, like a memory brushing against them. Rick inhaled deeply, eyes closed, letting the small details of sensation fill him. Morty mirrored him, letting the world seep through his senses as if it were a song only they could hear. They understood without words that attentiveness was a power in itself. One could move through life unnoticed, yet leave imprints through presence, through care, through noticing things others overlooked. Rick remembered a day from his childhood, a memory hazy with soft edges. He had watched a stranger drop a book on a park bench and without thinking had picked it up and returned it. The gratitude in the stranger's eyes had lingered with him for years, a quiet warmth stored deep in memory. Morty too had his own quiet triumphs, a hand extended to comfort a friend, a gentle word offered without expectation, the patient act of letting someone speak while truly listening. Together they understood that the smallest gestures carried weight far beyond immediate perception. They wandered off the path into a grove, where light dappled the ground in shifting patterns. Rick noticed how shadows shifted over rocks and roots, tracing invisible pathways that seemed almost deliberate. Morty crouched to watch a tiny mushroom cluster, noting how each cap caught sunlight differently, forming soft halos of color. Rick felt a thrill, not of excitement, but of recognition. That beauty existed in every fold of life, often unnoticed, waiting for someone willing to pause and honor it. A faint hum brushed their awareness. Not mechanical, not electric, but alive in a way that suggested intention. Rick tilted his head, listening, sensing the subtle pulse vibrating beneath the soil, through the roots up into the trees. Morty did the same, feeling the soft resonance in his chest. They shared a look, a brief connection of understanding. The world spoke in whispers, in vibrations, in patterns only those who listened could interpret. There was no urgency, no danger, only presence, patience, and gentle attention. Rick reached down to touch the bark of an ancient tree, fingers tracing the ridges that told the story of decades. Morty crouched nearby, tracing the outlines of small roots that wound across the ground like tentative veins. "Do you think they remember?" Morty asked softly, referring to the tree, the creek, the stones that lined the grove. Rick nodded, considering the question. "Not like we do," he said, "but in their own way. Every stretch, every growth, every bending toward light is a memory. A quiet act of persistence that matters more than we know." They moved through the grove with slow, deliberate steps, noticing the interplay of light and shadow, the subtle hum of life beneath the surface, the way the wind shifted patterns across leaves and soil. Rick began to see connections he had not before. A fallen leaf landing in a small puddle, a ripple carrying the reflection of clouds, a small bird pausing mid-flight as if acknowledging their presence. Morty noticed the same, feeling a thrill that was less about excitement and more about alignment, the soft harmony of being in sync with life itself. As the sun climbed higher, Rick and Morty reached a small clearing where wildflowers formed a patchwork of color, petals brushing against one another in the faintest breeze. Rick knelt, running a hand lightly across the flowers, feeling the subtle texture, the soft hum of energy that seemed almost like a heartbeat beneath the petals. Morty sat beside him, observing with quiet reverence, allowing the simple act of noticing to sink deep into his awareness. Each flower, each blade of grass became a small teacher, a lesson in patience, persistence, and quiet wonder. Rick spoke softly, words deliberate and unhurried. "Sometimes the smallest things teach the greatest lessons," he said. Morty nodded, understanding that the act of observing, of honoring small gestures of life was itself a kind of magic. It was a quiet strength, a gentle heroism, a power that did not announce itself but shaped the world with subtle insistence. They stayed there for some time, listening to the hum of life, letting the wind carry their awareness into the space between trees, rocks, and sky. Even as shadows lengthened and the day leaned toward evening, they remained in the clearing, bathed in soft gold light. Rick noticed the patterns of color shifting as the sun fell, each flower and leaf catching the light differently, forming mosaics of delicate warmth. Morty leaned back against a tree, eyes closed, absorbing the quiet symphony of movement and sound around them. They understood that time did not need to rush, that the pulse of life moved in rhythms far older and wiser than theirs. And as the first stars began to appear, timid yet persistent, Rick and Morty let the world cradle them in its gentle embrace. The grove, the creek, the trees and flowers pulsed softly with life, with memory, with the quiet assurance that existence carried meaning in its smallest acts. They closed their eyes together, letting the hum of the universe settle into them, a lullaby of presence, observation, and gentle continuity. The twilight settled slowly, stretching shadows long and soft across the town, carrying the faint hum of evening through rooftops and alleys. Rick and Morty walked side by side, their pace unhurried, attuned to the subtle rhythms of the world around them. Rick noticed the delicate shimmer of the fading sunlight against the edges of windows, the way it traced invisible lines across walls and pavements, and felt a quiet thrill in the ordinary brilliance of the day. Morty followed, sensing the same gentle pulse, the soft hum of things moving in spaces unnoticed. They wandered toward the outskirts, where the air smelled of wet earth and cooling grass, carrying the faint, persistent scent of flowers still reluctant to fold into night. Rick ran a hand along a fence post, worn smooth by years of wind and hands passing over it, and felt the quiet story etched into its grain. Morty crouched to study a small patch of moss, marveling at its soft, undulating growth and the delicate interplay of shadow and light upon its surface. In these moments, silence became a companion, the world speaking in whispers only they were willing to hear. They came across an old, forgotten pathway, lined with stones that had shifted and settled over decades. Rick stepped carefully, noticing the subtle textures, the way moss clung to corners and small weeds pushed through cracks, as if determined to mark their presence. Morty followed, watching the path as if it were a river of memory, each stone holding the quiet echo of footsteps long gone. They moved together, each step deliberate, feeling the rhythm of a world alive with stories that asked only to be noticed. Rick recalled a moment from years ago, a memory he could hardly name, of leaving a note for a stranger he had never met. The small act, unnoticed by the wider world, had created ripples, subtle and unseen, yet profound in their quiet persistence. Morty, too, had begun to practice such quiet acts of care, tending to forgotten flowers, returning lost objects, offering small gestures that carried warmth without expectation. They understood that these were the true threads of heroism, invisible yet strong, capable of connecting lives without fanfare or recognition. The pathway led them into a small grove, where twilight filtered through dense branches, casting pools of muted gold and violet. Rick knelt to examine a fallen leaf, delicate and curled, and traced the veins with a fingertip, marveling at its intricate, patient design. Morty observed a small insect crawling along the bark of a tree, pausing to study its careful movements, the meticulous way it navigated its world. They shared a silent understanding. Attention itself was a gift, a subtle power that allowed one to witness the extraordinary in the ordinary. A soft breeze stirred the grove, carrying whispers of movement through leaves and grass. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind speak in rhythms he could almost feel, the faint vibrations beneath his skin like a heartbeat belonging to the earth. Morty leaned against a tree, listening, letting the pulse of life wrap around him as if it had always known him. In the gentle sway of air and foliage, they understood that presence, patient and deliberate, could alter the world more than force or urgency ever could. Rick noticed the stars beginning to pierce the twilight, tentative pinpricks of light blinking softly above the darkening trees. He imagined them as distant stories, each one a life, a secret, a memory waiting to be traced. Morty traced imaginary constellations with his finger, mapping connections between points of light in patterns that only he could see. They both felt the same quiet awe, a reverence for the soft persistence of existence, for the way small unnoticed events could ripple outward, shaping life in subtle, beautiful ways. A small bird landed on a low branch, wings folding carefully, eyes bright and attentive. Rick watched it for a long moment, sensing its vigilance and quiet trust, and he felt again the lesson he had carried since childhood. Noticing, observing and respecting life's rhythms was a kind of quiet heroism. Morty crouched near the trunk, feeling the vibration of the bird's heartbeat through the branch, an invisible connection forming between observer and life. No words were necessary. The presence alone spoke volumes. They moved through the grove slowly, tracing the soft lines of shadows cast by trees and fallen leaves. Rick observed the subtle interplay of light and darkness, the way each shadow carried a story of its own, bending and stretching in the gentle rhythm of evening. Morty felt the same pulse in his chest, a quiet resonance that promised connection and understanding, a reminder that the universe moved in loops of patience and attention, not in loud gestures or hurried leaps. At the edge of the grove, they came upon an old stone bench, moss-covered and worn by countless seasons. Rick sat first, running a hand across its surface, feeling the contours left by decades of quiet use. Morty followed, settling beside him, letting the weight of the evening press softly against his shoulders. They did not speak, for words would only interrupt the rhythm of the world. Instead they listened, the whisper of wind through the leaves, the faint hum of distant life, the soft pulse of existence that persisted beneath every ordinary moment. As night deepened, stars scattered across the sky like tiny lanterns, blinking slowly, deliberately, in rhythms older than anyone could name. Rick traced them with a fingertip in the air, connecting invisible lines between points of light, mapping stories that existed beyond speech or memory. Morty mirrored the gesture, weaving constellations in patterns that felt both personal and eternal. They shared a quiet understanding. That presence, patience and gentle attention were a kind of magic, subtle yet enduring, capable of shaping worlds in ways unseen but deeply felt. The grove hummed softly with life, insects moving in delicate synchrony, leaves brushing against one another in gentle conversation, the faint ripple of a distant stream. Rick and Morty closed their eyes, letting the gentle vibrations of the universe settle into their bones. Each breath, each heartbeat, became part of the rhythm of the world, a quiet music that needed no conductor, no audience, only attentive listeners, and with that they leaned against the old bench, allowing the hum of existence, faint and insistent, to cradle them into a soft, dreamless sleep. The world continued its patient pulse around them, carrying their quiet presence like a feather drifting on a gentle breeze, a lullaby that promised warmth, attention, and the soft persistence of life. The world outside the small town was quiet now, not empty, but filled with the gentle hum of life that went unnoticed by most. Rick and Morty walked slowly along a narrow lane that led toward the hills, their footsteps soft against the dirt, blending with the muted songs of evening insects. Rick's mind was alive in its usual way, attentive to patterns, rhythms, and the subtle pulse of possibility that seemed to hum beneath the ground itself. Morty, following closely, felt the same quiet vibration, his senses tuned not to hurry or discovery, but to gentle awareness. The lane curved upward, bordered by hedges tangled and thick, heavy with the scent of wildflowers still clinging to life despite the fading light. Rick brushed his hand along the leaves, feeling their slight resistance, their faint warmth. Morty crouched to observe a small cluster of clover, tracing the delicate veins in the leaves with his fingertip, sensing the slow rhythm of growth beneath his touch. In these small acts of attention, they both felt a kind of intimacy with the world that was deeper than words could capture. As they climbed, Rick noticed the shadows stretching long and soft across the ground, their shapes shifting subtly with the tilt of the fading sun. Morty's eyes followed them, noting the interplay of darkness and light, the way each shadow hinted at shapes and stories beyond immediate perception. They moved together, slow and deliberate, understanding that the journey mattered less than the noticing. The small, quiet observations that wove a tapestry of connection between themselves and the world. At the crest of the hill, a field stretched wide and unbroken, dotted with wild grasses that swayed gently in the wind. Rick stepped forward, letting the air carry the scent of distant earth and faint blooms, closing his eyes for a moment to absorb the full presence of life. Morty did the same, feeling the subtle pulse of the field beneath his feet, the rhythm of growth and persistence that had gone unnoticed by generations before them. Each blade of grass, each whisper of wind became a story, quiet but insistent, and they were its attentive witnesses. Rick paused near a solitary tree standing at the center of the field. Its branches reached outward in patient arcs, leaves trembling in the soft breeze. He ran a hand along its trunk, feeling the roughness of bark, the gentle swell of years within its form. Morty knelt at its roots, feeling the vibration of life pulsing faintly, as if the tree itself held secrets it was willing to share with those who would listen. The tree seemed alive in a profound way, a quiet teacher of patience, of endurance, of the small persistence that defines existence. They stayed beneath the tree, letting the world flow around them. Rick observed the movement of clouds above, their shapes slow and deliberate, folding into one another with quiet grace. Morty noticed the subtle sounds of the field, a distant cricket, the faint rustle of grass against grass, the gentle sigh of wind brushing through leaves. Each detail, minute yet significant, carried its own story, and the act of noticing became a shared ritual, a kind of communion between observer and observed. Rick's thoughts drifted to the portal, its gentle hum echoing in memory, a reminder of worlds beyond the visible, of life that moved in unseen dimensions. Morty, sensing the faint shift in Rick's attention, placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, grounding him in the present, sharing a quiet reassurance. Together they watched the day lean toward evening, the colors of the sky shifting from gold to amber to soft indigo, each transition imperceptibly slow yet full of meaning. A bird alighted on a branch nearby, its wings folding carefully, eyes bright with attentiveness. Rick and Morty observed it without speaking, allowing their presence to blend with the quiet rhythm of the world. The bird chirped softly, a note that felt like a question and an answer at once, and Rick felt the hum of life vibrating through him, a subtle echo of all things interconnected. Morty leaned closer, noticing the faint shadow of the wings, the delicate curve of feathers, and felt a swell of quiet awe. The field stretched farther than the eye could see, each corner filled with soft movement, grass bending in the wind, distant shapes of hills folding into one another, clouds moving as if in slow meditation. Rick and Morty wandered through it, careful not to disturb the rhythm, letting each step fall in harmony with the pulse of existence. They passed a small hidden stream, its water clear and cool, moving over smooth stones in a gentle cadence. Rick cupped a hand in the water, feeling the chill and flow, and Morty knelt beside him, letting the current trace delicate patterns along his fingers. As darkness approached, the stars began to emerge, tentative at first, then steadily more confident, blinking softly above the hills. Rick traced invisible lines between them, mapping constellations not seen by ordinary eyes, but felt in the chest, patterns that pulsed with quiet meaning. Morty followed, his fingertips drawing delicate arcs in the air, connecting points of light into constellations of patience, empathy, and gentle wonder. They understood that these patterns, though unseen by others, carried weight in the quiet chambers of the heart. The first hints of night wrapped the field in a soft, deep blue, and the hum of life shifted, quieter now yet insistent. Rick and Morty lay on the grass beneath the tree side by side, letting the pulse of the earth and stars cradle them. The world continued its slow, deliberate rhythm, insects moving softly, leaves brushing against each other, the faint murmur of wind through distant hills. They were small participants in this vast, tender system, their attention amplifying its quiet magic, their presence a gentle affirmation of life's persistent beauty. Rick exhaled softly, a gentle acknowledgement of the day's quiet revelations, the persistence of growth, the harmony of life, the subtle power of attentiveness. Morty leaned against him, sharing warmth and presence, letting the lull of night and the hum of the world carry them towards sleep. Each heartbeat, each breath, synchronized with the soft rhythms around them, a quiet lullaby of connection, observation, and gentle wonder, and with that they closed their eyes, letting the soft pulse of existence cradle them fully, a gentle tide that promised presence, awareness, and quiet magic. The stars above blinked patiently, the grass whispered softly, and the world hummed, waiting for those who would listen, for those who would care, for those who would simply be. The night was soft, not heavy, and the world seemed to hold its breath as Rick and Morty wandered through the quiet streets of the town. Streetlights cast pools of gentle amber, reflecting on cracked pavement and the edges of forgotten alleys. Rick's eyes scanned the subtle movements in the dark, noticing the slight sway of branches, the flutter of a moth against the lamp, the slow drift of leaves across empty sidewalks. Morty followed closely, sensing the same quiet rhythm. Aware that the ordinary world held secret stories for those willing to look and listen, they came to a small park, tucked between two buildings, a place Rick had passed countless times, but never noticed fully until this moment. The swings hung still, casting long shadows across the ground, and the faint scent of damp grass rose from the earth. Rick walked slowly, his fingers brushing along the cold metal of a swing chain, feeling its rough texture and imagining the many hands that had held it before. Morty crouched to examine the grass, noticing tiny insects moving in careful patterns, each one a small participant in a larger, unseen order. Rick thought of the portal, its faint hum a memory beneath the quiet of the night, and he smiled softly. He remembered how curiosity had once led him to strange worlds, not in search of danger, but in search of understanding. Morty, sensing the subtle shift in Rick's mood, touched his arm lightly, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared awareness. Together they moved with gentle attention, letting each step and glance carry meaning, observing the world not to change it, but to witness it fully. The moon rose pale and steady, casting silver light across rooftops and trees, transforming the ordinary into something quietly luminous. Rick noticed the way the light fell on broken windows, tracing the cracks and illuminating shards of reflection. Morty watched as shadows bent and stretched across the grass, forming soft, transient patterns that seemed to dance to the rhythm of the night. There was no urgency, no need to act. Presence itself was enough, a gentle meditation on being alive and aware. They found a low stone wall at the edge of the park and sat, letting the cool surface support them as they looked up at the sky. Rick traced constellations with a fingertip, connecting invisible points into shapes that existed more in feeling than in sight. Morty mirrored him, mapping his own constellations, subtle patterns of memory and hope that only he could see. They shared a quiet wonder in the act, a recognition that the universe held stories beyond words, and that sometimes listening and observing was the truest way to participate in its magic. A small bird landed nearby, its wings folding softly, eyes bright and curious. Rick and Morty watched without moving, sensing the fragile pulse of life vibrating from the creature. The bird hopped closer, unafraid, as if drawn to the quiet attention they offered. Rick reached out a hand not to touch but to acknowledge, and Morty followed, feeling the subtle warmth of connection that required nothing more than presence. It chirped softly, a delicate note that seemed to say in its own way that all was observed and appreciated. The world shifted subtly as they continued to wander, moving along narrow paths lined with hedges and flower beds. Rick noticed how shadows pooled in certain corners, the way light fragmented over leaves and petals, revealing hidden geometries of form and movement. Morty bent to examine a cluster of small white flowers, feeling their delicate weight in his palm and noticing the way they trembled in the breeze. Every detail became a lesson, a quiet reminder that the extraordinary often resided in the ordinary, waiting for those willing to see it. Rick spoke softly, words deliberate and unhurried. "Sometimes," he said, "the smallest moments leave the deepest traces." Morty nodded, understanding that the act of noticing, of honoring life in its quiet, persistent ways, was itself a kind of heroism. They continued through the park, observing the soft movement of night insects, the sway of grass, the gentle brushing of leaves, aware that the universe carried a rhythm far older and wiser than themselves. They reached a small fountain in the center of the park, dry now, its stone surface cool and worn smooth by decades. Rick ran a hand along the rim, tracing faint etchings left by time, feeling the stories embedded in its grooves. Morty knelt beside him, placing a hand on the stone, feeling the subtle pulse of energy that lingered there. They shared the quiet recognition that every object, every living thing held a narrative, invisible but potent, shaped not by urgency or drama, but by patient presence. The stars grew brighter, each one a tiny lantern in the dark, blinking slowly as if breathing. Rick and Morty lay back on the soft grass near the fountain, letting the earth support them, feeling its subtle heartbeat beneath their bodies. The world hummed gently around them, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint chirp of distant creatures, the whisper of wind carrying distant scents and sounds. They allowed themselves to be cradled by this lullaby, understanding that sometimes adventure was not in moving outward, but in sinking inward, observing, noticing, and becoming attuned to the quiet symphony of existence. Rick's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the faint outlines of distant hills merged with the deepening blue of night. Morty followed his eyes, seeing the subtle gradient of color, the soft haze that separated earth from sky, and felt the hum of connection vibrating between them and the world. Each moment was a gentle affirmation, a reminder that attention and care, even in silence, could resonate far beyond immediate perception. They remained there for hours, side by side, listening to the pulse of life and night, tracing invisible constellations with fingertips, breathing in sync with the soft rhythm of the world. Rick felt a profound calm, a sense of alignment that came not from control, but from observance and quiet empathy. Morty felt the same, the hum of life settling into his chest, a gentle assurance that being present, being attentive, was itself a form of love. As the night deepened, the stars blinked with steady patience, and the world seemed to fold into itself soft and unhurried. Rick and Morty closed their eyes, allowing the hum of existence to carry them into rest. Every breath, every heartbeat, became part of the quiet symphony, a lullaby of attention, presence, and subtle connection, and with that, they drifted into soft, dreamless sleep, cradled by the night, wrapped in gentle understanding, held by the patient pulse of life that whispered that all was as it should be. The first pale hints of dawn crept over the horizon, brushing the edges of the town in soft, quiet gold. Rick and Morty stirred from sleep beneath the familiar blanket of night's lingering calm, their bodies warmed by shared presence and the memory of the gentle rhythms that had carried them through darkness. Rick stretched slowly, feeling the subtle pull of muscles and sinew, aware of the quiet hum of life that persisted even in stillness. Morty followed, letting his arms and legs unfold into motion, the soft creak of joints harmonizing with the delicate world awakening around them. The streets were nearly empty, a few early risers moving like shadows, their steps soft and deliberate. Rick and Morty wandered without destination, letting curiosity guide them. The air smelled faintly of dew and earth, of flowers reluctant to release their night's perfume. Rick ran a hand along a fence post, worn smooth by decades of weather and touch, feeling its grain and the history imbued in its fibers. Morty bent to watch a small beetle tracing its path along the rough wood, marveling at the meticulous precision of its tiny journey. Every moment carried quiet significance, unnoticed by most but rich with life for those willing to pay attention. They came to the edge of the small river that cut through the town, its surface glimmering in the newborn light. Rick knelt, letting his fingers skim the cool water, noting the subtle currents and the way sunlight fractured into tiny rainbows over each ripple. Morty sat beside him on a smooth rock, listening to the faint murmur of the river, letting it carry a soft rhythm into his chest. The water moved without urgency, persistent and patient, a quiet teacher of continuity and gentle force. They understood wordlessly that the river held stories in its flow, invisible yet profoundly felt. Rick traced the ripples with his fingers, watching how each disturbance expanded and merged, reminding him of the small acts of kindness and attention that spread quietly through the world. Morty's eyes followed a tiny fish darting beneath the surface, its movements deliberate and instinctual, each one a subtle assertion of life's persistence. Rick smiled softly. "Even the smallest ripple can travel far," he said. Morty nodded, feeling the truth of it in his chest. Understanding that the quiet, unnoticed actions of a life carried resonance beyond immediate perception, they moved along the riverbank, stepping carefully over roots and stones, noticing how the soft light highlighted textures and details, invisible in darkness. Rick admired the curve of a low-hanging branch, the way moss clung to one side, bending ever so slightly under its weight. Morty crouched to observe a small patch of wildflowers, each petal trembling faintly in the breeze, each one distinct yet part of a subtle, larger pattern. The act of noticing, of giving attention, became a ritual, a meditation that tied them gently to the pulse of the world. A heron lifted from the river, wings stretching slowly before it rose into the soft morning sky. Rick watched it arc above them, graceful and deliberate, and felt a quiet awe settle deep within him. Morty tilted his head, following the bird's path, sensing its persistence, its patience, its quiet power. In the heron's steady, unhurried flight, they both recognized a lesson. Life moved forward in deliberate rhythm, not through haste or force, but through attention, care, and the willingness to continue. The riverbank widened into a small meadow, grass tipped with dew, reflecting the early light in a delicate shimmer. Rick walked slowly, letting his feet brush softly against the wet blades, feeling the cool dampness rise through his shoes, an intimate connection with the ground beneath. Morty sat among the grass, letting his fingers trace the gentle curve of leaves and petals, marveling at the way life persisted quietly, insistently, in forms both delicate and strong. They both felt the hum of continuity in these small acts, a resonance that required only awareness to be felt fully. Rick leaned back, letting the meadow hold him, closing his eyes and listening. The sound of water, the faint stir of leaves, the soft call of birds, and the distant subtle hum of the town awakening wove together into a quiet symphony. Morty mirrored him, eyes closed, letting the rhythm seep into his chest, feeling the invisible threads that connected every moving, living part of the scene. In this shared awareness, they found a profound connection not just to each other, but to the world itself. A gentle wind picked up, carrying distant scents of pine and earth and the faint sweetness of morning blooms. Rick inhaled, letting the mixture fill him, and Morty did the same, letting it settle deep into his awareness. The wind seemed to speak, not in words but in subtle vibrations, suggesting stories and histories that had passed quietly, waiting to be noticed. Rick reached out a hand, brushing against the tops of grass, feeling the tiny tremors and subtle resistance, a communion with life that required nothing but presence. They followed the river through the meadow, letting the curves of the water guide their path, noticing every small ripple, every reflection, every subtle shimmer of movement. Rick spoke softly, words gentle and deliberate. "The world is patient," he said. "It waits for those willing to notice." Morty nodded, understanding that this patience extended to all living things, to every action taken with care and attention, to every small gesture of presence that quietly resonated beyond the moment. As the sun rose higher, spilling gold across the meadow and water, Rick and Morty reached a small clearing where the river bent around a cluster of trees. They settled beneath the branches, feeling the warmth of sunlight filtering through leaves, the gentle pulse of life in the water, the soft vibration of the earth beneath them. The meadow, the river, the trees, and the sky all hummed in quiet harmony, a lullaby that required only attention and presence to fully hear. They closed their eyes, letting the warmth and the rhythm cradle them, allowing the gentle pulse of the morning to wash through them, softening every thought, every tension, every unspoken worry. The world continued in its quiet, deliberate rhythm. Water flowing, leaves rustling, birds calling softly, sunlight tracing patterns across their skin. Rick and Morty became part of the symphony, their breathing, their awareness, their gentle presence a contribution to the subtle, ongoing harmony of life, and with that they allowed themselves to drift, fully cradled by the pulse of existence, the gentle flow of the river, the soft hum of life, and the warmth of morning light. The world was patient, persistent, and full of quiet magic, waiting for those who would notice, those who would care, those who would simply be. The afternoon sunlight was gentle, diffused through high, thin clouds that painted the world in muted gold. Rick and Morty moved along the winding roads of the town, their steps soft against the cracked asphalt, aware of the quiet symphony of life surrounding them. Birds called faintly in the distance, the hum of insects hovered along the edges of fences and hedges, and the distant murmur of a stream echoed through narrow alleys. Rick's eyes traced the patterns of light and shadow across walls and windows, the subtle curves of architecture softened by time, and he felt a profound calm settle into his chest. Morty followed closely, observing the faint vibrations of leaves in the breeze, the way the sunlight caught on the edges of glass bottles left on porches, the faint glimmer of puddles reflecting the sky. Each detail, though small, carried a story, and they moved as though each story deserved their full attention. Rick reached out, touching a weathered fence post, feeling the grooves etched by decades of hands, noticing the subtle changes caused by sun, wind, and rain. Morty knelt beside a patch of moss, letting his fingertips trace the delicate weave of green that had persisted quietly over time. They wandered toward the outskirts of the town, where the houses became less frequent and the air carried the faint scent of earth and growth. Rick noticed a small garden tucked behind a rusted gate, flowers reaching hesitantly toward the sun, leaves trembling in the breeze. Morty crouched to observe a tiny caterpillar navigating a leaf, moving with deliberate, patient steps. Rick smiled softly, remembering how even the smallest lives carried resilience and purpose, an enduring rhythm of quiet persistence. The road opened into a meadow that rolled gently toward the horizon. Grass swayed in delicate waves, tipped with light as the sun moved across the sky. Rick walked slowly, letting his hand brush along the tall blades, feeling the subtle resistance and the faint hum of life that pulsed through them. Morty sat on a small rise, tracing the patterns of movement in the grass, imagining invisible threads connecting each blade to the next, each living element to the world around it. In the act of noticing, they both felt a profound sense of belonging, a quiet communion with existence itself. Rick paused near a cluster of wildflowers, watching how each petal trembled faintly in the soft wind. He bent, brushing a fingertip along one, feeling its delicate texture, and imagined the life that persisted quietly beneath the surface. Morty knelt beside him, feeling the faint warmth of the earth and the subtle vibration of growth beneath his fingers. Together, they allowed themselves to be present, absorbing the hum of life, aware that observation itself was a kind of reverence, a way to honor the persistence of existence. The sky shifted gradually, clouds moving in slow arcs, scattering soft light across the meadow. Rick traced the lines of the horizon, imagining constellations yet to appear, mapping invisible patterns in the movement of clouds and the gentle curves of hills. Morty followed his gaze, feeling a quiet thrill in the recognition of patterns, the invisible pulse that connected every living thing. They shared the understanding that life moved in rhythms, often unnoticed yet precise and deliberate, a gentle orchestration of persistence and attention. A small bird landed nearby, hopping delicately on one leg, wings folded, eyes bright and watchful. Rick observed it, noting the subtle tilt of its head, the careful positioning of feathers, the way it balanced with patient grace. Morty leaned closer, sensing the soft heartbeat of life in the tiny creature, feeling the resonance of patience and quiet purpose. They understood wordlessly that attention and care amplified the small magic of existence. That presence was a form of love and acknowledgement, in a world often too hurried to notice. Rick and Morty wandered further, reaching a small copse of trees where sunlight filtered through leaves in muted shafts, forming shifting mosaics on the forest floor. Rick crouched, noticing the curve of a root, the gentle swell of moss, the delicate scratch of insects across bark. Morty examined a fallen leaf, tracing its veins with a fingertip, marveling at the intricate geometry, the quiet insistence of life even in decay. They moved slowly, deliberately, each step an act of attention, each breath a meditation on the small persistence that defined existence. Rick spoke softly, words deliberate yet tender. "Life isn't always about grand gestures," he said. "It's the small quiet acts, the things that happen while the world isn't looking, that shape everything." Morty nodded, feeling the truth of it in his chest, understanding that the gentle touch, the act of noticing, the simple presence of attention, could echo far beyond the moment, leaving invisible ripples in the currents of life. They emerged from the copse into a clearing where a gentle stream wound through tall grass. Rick knelt beside it, letting water pass between his fingers, observing the way it curved around stones, paused briefly, and continued on its path. Morty crouched beside him, tracing a line of tiny ripples that reflected the soft sky above. They both felt the quiet poetry in motion, persistence, continuity, the subtle interplay of time and attention. The stream moved without hurry, yet it carried everything forward, patient and inevitable, a teacher of gentle resilience. The afternoon deepened into evening, the sky shifting from muted gold to soft lavender. Rick and Morty lay down in the grass near the stream, letting their bodies sink into the soft earth, feeling its hum beneath them. The world around them pulsed in quiet rhythms, water rippling, grass swaying, distant bird calls, the soft vibration of life threading through everything. They allowed themselves to become part of the pattern, their awareness, their presence, their gentle observation woven into the ongoing lullaby of the meadow. Rick exhaled slowly, a quiet acknowledgement of the lesson carried in every small detail. Morty mirrored him, feeling the pulse of life settle into his chest, the rhythm of existence syncing with their own. The world continued its patient hum, indifferent to urgency, yet full of subtle magic, waiting for those who would listen, those who would notice, those who would care enough to pay attention. And with that, they closed their eyes, allowing the stream, the grass, the faint hum of life, and the soft fall of light to cradle them. The meadow whispered its lullaby, the trees murmured softly, and the sky above held them in quiet watchfulness, a gentle embrace that promised presence, patience, and the magic of simply being. Night draped itself gently across the town, soft and velvety, carrying the scent of distant earth and the faint trace of flowers that had lingered through the day. Rick and Morty walked through quiet streets, their footsteps muted by the gentle hum of evening life. Windows reflected the amber glow of streetlights, fractured by cracks and panes long weathered by wind and rain. Rick's eyes traced the subtle play of light and shadow, the way each corner seemed to hold its own secret, and he felt a quiet thrill, a recognition of the world's patient, persistent beauty. Morty followed, noticing the faint vibrations in the air, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant murmurs of life unseen, sensing the same delicate pulse that made the ordinary feel extraordinary. They moved toward the river, where water whispered over smooth stones, carrying with it the faint shimmer of moonlight. Rick knelt to touch the surface, feeling the cool flow ripple over his fingers, tracing paths that were both transient and deliberate. Morty sat beside him on the grass, letting the subtle hum of the river settle into his chest. The water spoke in whispers of movement, of time passing unnoticed, of quiet persistence, and they both felt the rhythm resonate deeply within them. In the ripple of water, in the gentle shift of light across the surface, they found a quiet lesson, that life persisted, even when unseen, shaping worlds with a steady, unhurried hand. They wandered along the bank, careful not to disturb the delicate pulse of life surrounding them. Fireflies blinked softly in the dusk, tracing faint arcs through the air, tiny lanterns of patience and persistence. Rick watched their careful movements, noting the subtle dance of light and shadow, the way each blink carried a story of survival, of quiet insistence, of small brilliance in darkness. Morty leaned closer to observe, marveling at the way these tiny beings moved with intention, each blink a gentle testament to life's persistent beauty. A gentle wind stirred the branches of nearby trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth and distant flowers. Rick inhaled, letting the mixture settle in his awareness, and Morty mirrored him, feeling the subtle vibrations move through his chest. They understood without words that presence and attention were themselves a kind of magic, amplifying the quiet brilliance of life around them. Even the smallest act of noticing, the gentle acknowledgement of existence, carried weight and resonance. Rick and Morty reached a small wooden bridge arching over the river, its boards worn smooth by decades of passage. Rick ran a hand along the railing, feeling the subtle grooves and imperfections, imagining the countless moments that had passed over it, unnoticed yet profound. Morty crouched to examine a cluster of moss growing along the side, tracing the delicate weave of green with a fingertip, sensing the persistence of life in quiet corners. Each detail, though subtle, seemed alive, as if the world had been waiting for attentive eyes to recognize it. They lingered there, watching the moonlight ripple across the water, tracing patterns that were never the same twice. Rick traced the arcs of reflection with his eyes, imagining invisible lines connecting each flicker of light, a map of quiet persistence. Morty reached out, letting his hand hover above the water, feeling the faint tremor of movement, the subtle pulse that spoke of life beyond sight. They shared a soft understanding. The world carried rhythms beyond comprehension, and their role was not to control but to witness, to honor, to be present. A small heron rose silently from the riverbank, wings stretching gracefully as it lifted into the night sky. Rick and Morty watched it ascend, its movements deliberate, patient, and precise. The bird's silent flight seemed to echo the gentle lessons they had absorbed: persistence, attention, patience, and quiet beauty. Morty whispered softly, almost to himself, "Even the smallest things have their own way of moving through the world." Rick nodded, feeling the truth of it resonate deep in his chest, aware that the world's quiet magic was woven into everything, from birds in flight to ripples on water, to the soft pulse of life beneath their feet. They continued along the river, each step deliberate, letting the rhythm of their own breathing align with the pulse of the night. The river carried the faint reflection of stars above, distant points of light mirrored in the water's surface. Rick traced them with a fingertip in the air, mapping constellations that existed in memory and imagination, connecting stories invisible to others but deeply felt by them. Morty mirrored the gesture, weaving his own patterns, tracing arcs that felt both personal and eternal, understanding that sometimes connection was found not in words, but in shared attention and gentle recognition. The night deepened, the air thick with calm, and they reached a small grove where the river curved around a cluster of trees. Rick leaned against a trunk, letting its solidity ground him, feeling the subtle vibration of life in its bark, in its roots pressed into the earth. Morty sat beside him, eyes closed, letting the sound of water and leaves, the hum of insects and the soft sigh of the wind lull him into stillness. They became part of the grove, not separate observers but threads in its quiet tapestry, witnesses to the subtle orchestration of life that required only attention and presence to be fully realized. Rick spoke softly, words slow and deliberate. "The world doesn't always need us to act," he said. "Sometimes it just needs us to notice, to care, to exist alongside it with awareness." Morty nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep into his chest. In the stillness of the grove, beneath the soft glow of moonlight and stars, they allowed themselves to fully absorb the quiet rhythm of existence, letting every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle vibration harmonize with the persistent pulse of life. The stars grew brighter, blinking softly through the branches, casting faint mosaics of light on the grass and water. Rick and Morty closed their eyes, letting the night carry them into rest. The river whispered, leaves murmured, insects hummed, and the grove held them in gentle embrace, a lullaby composed of subtle persistence and quiet magic. Presence, attention, and care had become the softest form of connection. A reminder that even in stillness, life moved, and that being there, being aware, was a gift in itself. And with that they surrendered to the hum of the night, cradled by the river, the trees, the stars, and the gentle pulse of life itself. Each breath, each heartbeat became part of the quiet symphony, a lullaby of awareness, presence, and subtle wonder. The world continued its patient rhythm, waiting for those who would notice, those who would care, those who would simply be. The world had settled into a gentle, unbroken rhythm as Rick and Morty walked along a quiet country path. The fading light of evening, casting long, soft shadows across fields of tall grass. The air carried the faint scent of earth and flowers, a memory of daytime warmth lingering in the cool folds of twilight. Rick moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the edge of the path with his fingertips, feeling the subtle roughness of stones, the occasional brush of a stray blade of grass, and the pulse of life in the soft, yielding earth beneath his shoes. Morty followed, his own senses attuned to the quiet hum around them, the gentle rhythm of a world that persisted in patient, unnoticed ways. They reached a small pond, its surface still and reflective, like a mirror holding fragments of sky and memory. Rick crouched to touch the water, noting the ripple that spread across its surface, subtle yet deliberate. Morty knelt beside him, placing a hand in the water, feeling the cool resistance and the soft tremor of life beneath. The pond seemed to carry stories of countless nights, of moons rising and setting, of stars reflecting briefly and disappearing. In its stillness there was continuity, a quiet lesson of persistence and patience, an invitation to slow down and absorb the subtle magic of being. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the scent of distant pines and wet earth. Brushing across Rick's face and Morty's, they breathed it in, letting it settle deep into their awareness, a reminder that the world was alive in ways subtle and constant, and that every detail, however small, carried weight if only it was noticed. Rick spoke softly, words deliberate and reverent. "It's in the quiet, Morty. Not in grand gestures or loud declarations. Life moves in whispers," Morty nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into the soft spaces of his chest, a slow, steady warmth spreading in understanding and recognition. They wandered along the pond's edge, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of water, plants, and insects. Dragonflies skimmed lightly over the surface, tracing arcs that seemed deliberate, precise, and beautiful. Rick watched them, noting the elegance of motion, the interplay of light on wings, the subtle way life persisted in forms both delicate and resilient. Morty crouched to watch a small frog leap from one stone to another, its movement deliberate yet unhurried, a miniature act of persistence in the quiet world around them. Every small motion seemed to ripple, carrying significance beyond what was immediately visible. As darkness deepened, the first stars began to emerge, blinking softly above, reflected faintly in the water below. Rick traced invisible constellations in the night sky, mapping stories in patterns that existed more in feeling than in sight. Morty followed, drawing his own delicate lines between points of light, letting the act of observation itself become a quiet meditation. They felt the resonance of these invisible stories, a subtle connection to the vastness above and the intimacy of life below, intertwined in ways that required only awareness to perceive. A lone heron rose from the pond, wings stretching gracefully as it ascended into the night sky. Rick and Morty watched silently, sensing the deliberate precision in its flight, the patient assertion of life moving forward in quiet, unseen ways. Morty whispered softly, "Even when we don't see it, life keeps moving, doesn't it?" Rick nodded, exhaling slowly, feeling the hum of truth in the night around them. Every ripple, every wing beat, every shadow carried forward the quiet insistence of existence, a lullaby composed in invisible threads that connected all living things. They continued along the path, moving toward a gentle rise where the trees opened to a small hilltop. Rick paused, letting the wind brush past him, carrying scents of distant fields and the faint perfume of night-blooming flowers. Morty leaned against a tree, feeling the subtle hum of life in its bark, the steady presence of roots that held firm in the earth. They were participants, small yet attentive, in a world that thrived quietly, persistently and generously, offering lessons and solace to those who noticed. The sky deepened into indigo, stars scattering like pinpricks of patient light across its expanse. Rick and Morty lay down on the soft grass, the hilltop cradling them gently, letting their bodies sink into the earth's embrace. The world pulsed around them, water murmuring in the pond below, leaves brushing softly against one another, insects stirring in the grass, the faint hum of life threading through everything. Each sound, each movement became a note in a lullaby, delicate and precise, a symphony of subtle persistence and quiet care. Rick exhaled, letting the hum of life fill him fully. "It's all here, Morty. Even when we don't understand it, even when we think we're too small, we're part of it." Morty nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest, recognition that being present, being aware, being kind in quiet ways, was itself a contribution to the rhythm of existence. They closed their eyes, letting the night carry them into a gentle rest, bodies and minds cradled by the pulse of life, by the soft cadence of wind, water, and stars. A faint owl called in the distance, its voice soft yet insistent, a reminder of life that moves unseen, but observed by those willing to listen. Rick and Morty let its sound become part of their shared meditation, part of the quiet acknowledgement that existence persisted with subtle power, carrying on its steady course regardless of notice, yet amplified by attention and care. The night around them held a gentle promise, that presence and observation were acts of quiet magic, capable of softening hearts and connecting them to the larger hum of life. They remained on the hilltop, bathed in moonlight and starlight, feeling the world pulse beneath and around them. Each breath, each heartbeat, each gentle touch of the wind or rustle of leaves was part of a lullaby, a meditation, a soft celebration of the persistence of life. Rick and Morty drifted into stillness, letting the gentle cadence carry them into a peaceful, reflective state, the quiet rhythm of the world cradling them completely. And with that, they surrendered to the night, cradled by the trees, the pond, the wind, and the subtle, persistent pulse of existence. Every sensation, every whisper, every soft glow became part of the symphony, a lullaby that required only their attention and presence. The world hummed gently, patiently, and generously, waiting for those willing to see, to care, and to simply be.